Hi. This is Deckards Dream Mark II from Black Corporation. An 8-voice analog polyphonic desktop synth inspired by the legendary Yamaha CS-80, used among other by Vangelis on the soundtrack of Blade Runner, hence the name after the main character. In this video, I'll take a look at what it can do, how it compares to the original CS-80, and what makes this special, whether or not it's worth the price, and overall pros and cons. Before I start, a quick disclosure, Black Corp sent this over for review. It did cost me, but lower than retail. As always, they have no say over the content of this video. This channel is funded by viewers who subscribe to my content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and store affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Okay, let's get started. The first question you may have top of mind for a synth inspired by the CS-80 called Deckards Dream is, can it sound like the Blade Runner soundtrack? So let's do that first. Now, if you've heard a CS-80 in Blade Runner, you most likely heard it drenched in reverb. For this video, I've paired it with a CXM 1978, another replicant, this time of the Lexicon 224, the reverb originally used by Vangelis in Blade Runner. It has a modern hi-fi mode, but for the purpose of this video, I'll keep it in the standard 1978 mode. So there are a few things characteristic of the CS-80 in that soundtrack. I don't have an original CS-80 with me, unfortunately. I'll link below to an article that compares the two. But this should be a good example of a few brassy sounds and higher pitched leads. But if you pay attention, you can also hear the expression with which everything is played. A lot of that came from the keyboard it was connected to with polyphonic aftertouch and its famous pitch strip. Of course, you may ask, is it limited to just sounding like Vangelis? Let's listen to a few more presets. I think it's good not just at brassy, thick sounds, but also at gentle ones. This is without reverb, by the way. This is with. Here's another one I put together without reverb. The synth is polyphonic, of course. It also has a few Unison modes. With serious bottom end. No reverb applied here. Still sounds great. I'll link below to a playlist by Paul Schilling with dozens of examples of Deckards Dream. Let's move on to see how it works and how it compares to the CS-80. So aside from not weighing over 200 pounds or close to 100 kilos and not costing more than $20,000, though it's not cheap, and we'll get to that, feature-wise, I think that the most important thing that Deckards Dream doesn't have is a keyboard with polyphonic aftertouch. You won't be faulted for thinking that's not a big deal because most synths don't have one, but the reason that I think it's important here is that the sound of the CS-80, I think, is to a large degree special because of its polyphonic aftertouch and the emphasis on it on the user interface. 7 of the 70 or so sliders here, so 10% of them, are dedicated to how aftertouch, not velocity, impacts the sound. And if you excuse the pun, I'm hard-pressed to think of another synth that has just one slider dedicated to how aftertouch impacts its sound, let alone 7 of them. Let me give you an example of why that's important. I'll move it to panel mode. So we have the basic default preset. Now typically synths will modulate a filter envelope like this. A simple pre-programmed motion that moves the filter up and down and does make a nice sound, but repeats itself the same way regardless of the key you press or how you press it. With polyphonic aftertouch, your fingers become the filter envelopes. The connection between the filter cutoff and pressure applied to keys or pads is made using this slider. Controls brilliance or filter cutoff, and the more we push it up, the more impact we have with aftertouch over the filter cutoff. And I think that's a much more direct and expressive control, obviously with reverb. Way better than a static envelope that just does the same thing every time. So aftertouch can be applied to the filter cutoff, or just overall level, or both, of course. Aside from a direct connection between pressure to the filter cutoff or level, you can also use pressure to moderate or modulate the mod depth of the LFO. So this is our LFO impacting the filter on its own. And if we disable the direct connection and connect the touch response to the sub-oscillator to the LFO, then pressure determines the mod depth. Light pressure means no modulation by the LFO, and more pressure increases the modulation. This too is polyphonic, so it impacts notes differently depending on how I press them. So this upper note, for example, now without modulation and with pressure. Lower note without modulation and with pressure. And now this upper note without pressure. I know it's subtle and it's hard to see, but they're being modulated separately. You can hear it better maybe if I get back to the filter cutoff. With polyphonic aftertouch, notes just don't sound the same. Anyway, so back to the comparison to the CS-80, polyphonic aftertouch, which is very rare these days for some reason. In regular keyboards, you need to get a sort of special expressive style keyboard, existed in every CS-80. By the way, in case you're not seeing any cables and wondering how this is connected, this is the XKey Air. It actually doesn't have a MIDI out, so you can use either USB and a USB MIDI host or a wireless receiver, because this has both a built-in rechargeable battery and Bluetooth. Continuing the comparison to the CS-80, where Deckards, like any good replicant, I guess, is superior to the life form it's inspired by, is in how it handles MPE-capable controllers. If you have one like the LinnStrument here, or the Haken Continuum, or a Rolly Seaboard, you'll get 2 additional dimensions of control not found in the original CS-80 beyond per note pressure or polyphonic aftertouch. For this to work, you need to put it in MPE mode and not polyphonic aftertouch, which is this guy here. Now the CS-80 has a pitch bend strip, which is a nice plus, but that strip bends the pitch of all the notes you're holding, as does any MIDI keyboard, as opposed to being able to control the pitch of each note individually using MPE. So this feat where I hold one note, add another one, and only bend the pitch of the second note is something you can only do with an MPE controller and a synth that can understand or speak to MPE controllers. And then the third dimension of control, or the second additional one that you get if you use an MPE controller, is the Y-axis. Here I've got it connected to the LFO speed. So the more I move my finger up, the faster the LFO speed. And there are a few destinations here that you can assign to that. So not just LFO speed, but also all of these. Anyway, let's go back to LFO speed. So now that works polyphonically too. So I can affect the LFO speed of the right note and the left note separately. So I think that for a synth that was initially designed with so much of an emphasis towards touch response, adding 2 additional layers is quite a big deal. Another important difference between Deckards and the CS-80 is that Deckards doesn't have the ring mod, tremolo, and chorus circuits that the CS-80 does. Those were originally sold by Black Corp as a separate rack-mounted expander. There are still a few DIY kits I think left, but the expander has been discontinued and one was not sent in as part of this review, so I can't show you those features. I've heard the CS-80, and if I may say, the tremolo and chorus aren't much to write home about. You can always add that using an external pedal, but certainly an interesting aspect of it is the ring mod. An upcoming Rachel module will offer ring mod capabilities and may be paired with Deckards. Again, not available as of the time of this review. So for now, from that perspective, the CS-80 has a timbral edge over Deckards as far as ring mod is concerned. On the other hand, an area where Deckards outdoes the CS-80 is presets. It has substantially more presets, 124 factory presets, instead of just 22 sort of half presets with the buttons on the CS-80, and I think 9 banks of 128 user presets each, as opposed to only 2 or 4 user presets, depending on how you count the half presets. Presets on the Deckards Dream also save almost the entire state of the synth, unlike the CS-80, which only saved the 2 voice layers and not the state of the bottom row, or obviously any menu settings because it didn't have a menu. While we're on the topic of the menu, the panel is very CS-80-like, but there are additional features that are accessible if you're willing to menu dive. Not that much. The screen is pretty small, mainly configuration settings. I'll talk more about these later on. Aside from those differences, the slider layout, as far as I could tell, is identical to the CS-80, including a few quirks we'll get into in a bit. One more short comparison. This is the Mark II of Deckards Dream. The biggest improvement compared to Mark I is a substantial size difference between the two in terms of depth. The Mark I is 4 times thicker, around 20 centimeters or almost 8 inches, and had a heavy steel panel and I think a fan or two, as opposed to 5 centimeters or under 2 inches deep here. They achieved this by mounting components on both sides of the voice cards and presumably splitting them out more. Mark II also comes with wooden sides and optional rack ears, as opposed to forcing you to use a panel with rack ears on the Mark I. Mark II also supports MIDI over USB and a cleaner audio signal path and a few extra onboard controls. You also have a dedicated panel button, which I think is important. It ignores the preset and sets all the parameter values to their slider positions. The Mark I, however, does have an external input for the LFO. That input has been removed in Mark II, and the option was replaced with sample and hold option. More on that when we talk about the LFO or sub-oscillator. Okay, so that's it for the comparisons. Now let's take a look at what Deckards can actually do. I'll start with an overview. The first thing you'll be relieved to know, seeing so many sliders, is that the 2 top rows are entirely identical. Each of Deckards' 8 voices actually has 2 separate voices or 2 separate layers. Each of the layers has a single oscillator, but in a departure from typical synth voice structures, each layer has its own dual high and low pass filter, as well as separate filter and amplitude envelopes and separate polyphonic velocity and aftertouch modulation. So essentially it's like Deckards Dream and the CS-80, by the way, have 16 voices, only these voices are paired 2 layers for each of the 8 synth voices. Now you'll find some other synths where you can layer 2 different sounds, but usually they require using the same sliders and knobs for each layer, meaning that once you swap a layer and start changing things, the slider positions become meaningless because they don't reflect where the controls are actually at, leaving you guessing what's where. This dual layer structure gives you a ton of sound design and performance flexibility, and you control the mix between the 2 layers using this slider. So in this example, this is what layer 1 is doing. This is what layer 2 is doing, and together, this is what they're up to. They do share the same LFO, unfortunately. Let's take a look maybe at one more example. So here I've got a sawtooth in one layer and noise on the second layer, and I can filter each of these layers separately, mix and match them any way I like, with different filter and VCA envelopes in each layer. From a connectivity perspective, Deckards has a single mono audio output in the back and headphone outputs here. They're stereo, but the output itself is mono. You've got a very useful MIDI in, out, and through, and USB both for MIDI and a disk drive mode where you can transfer the preset banks back and forth. Continuing with the overview, the colors of the sliders aren't just for good looks. Red means you're controlling resonance. Green means you're controlling the filter cutoff, both filters. Yellow means you're controlling the release of the envelopes, both individually and globally. Gray typically means you're controlling levels, and things start to get a little bit less consistent with the black and white sliders. Speaking of lack of consistency, for some reason the designers of the CS-80 decided to make it so that the sliders on the top two rows work like every other slider on the planet, which is a good thing, meaning moving them up generally increases level, speed, or frequency. But all bets are off for the bottom row. In fact, most of the bottom row behaves exactly the opposite, meaning levels are lowest when you push the sliders up and you increase levels by bringing the sliders down. So whereas increasing resonance means moving this slider up, increasing it here, the global resonance, means moving this slider down. Same goes for here, filter cutoff. Down means increasing the filter cutoff frequency as opposed to increasing it, moving the slider up over here. Same here, but not with these sliders. If you know why, leave a comment below. Anyway, to remain faithful to the original CS-80, Deckards Dream follows suit and works the same way. You just need to get used to it. Okay, let's dive a little bit deeper and go to sort of like an init preset. Panel mode is always useful to make sure there are no preset remnants somewhere around here. So let's take a look at the anatomy of a single layer. Each layer has 3 oscillator shapes, a sawtooth, a variable pulse width with pulse width modulation, a noise generator, and another sine wave that sits after the filter section. So you control the level of what comes into the filter and out of the filter using this slider, and then a convenient sine wave post filter. The sine wave is at the same frequency as the main oscillator. It just lets you add bass in case you apply the high pass filter. So you can shape your sound using the high pass filter and still enjoy a healthy fundamental. The sawtooth is simple, nice, and beefy. The highs may be slightly chopped off compared to other synths, and the pulse has a built-in pulse width modulation LFO. Which is quite generous of the CS-80. You get 1 pulse width LFO per layer and 1 global LFO. The noise generator sounds like this. Straightforward. And then that gets fed into the dual high-pass, low-pass filter structure. High-pass filter and low-pass filter. Both with resonance, but a very gentle resonance. It doesn't self-oscillate. This, by the way, like I mentioned earlier, is the global resonance that applies to both layers. So while this resonance isn't crunchy or dirty like other synths, it has its character, certainly with reverb. Using the filters together, you can, of course, shape a bandpass filter. There's resonance on the high-pass filter as well, by the way. Again, very subtle, slightly nasal. The LFO and the pulse width modulation do go into somewhat near audio rates. So you can get extra character there. The oscillators are strong and beefy as can be expected. They're based on 3340 chips, and you've got separate octave and fifth controls for each of the layers, which is a nice touch to get instantly pleasing intervals. So let's go for a simple saw. Bring in layer 2. And there's a pretty nice range of intervals to explore here. Even though it's just octaves and fifths, the broad range gives you a lot to play with. You've You've got overall coarse and fine tuning controls for both layers, and you can detune layer 2 or channel 2 as it's called here. It would have been nice if you had separate coarse detuning for channel 2. Maybe they can add that as a firmware update. Back to the dual layers, like I mentioned earlier, you've got separate filters for both layers. And since it's hard to move 4 sliders at once, you've got global, both cutoff and resonance controls. Okay, so those are the core oscillators and filter. Let's talk about the envelopes. Each layer has 2 envelopes, an ADSR envelope for level, and it may not look like this. This is also sort of like an ADSR envelope for the filter cutoff. It is designed, however, very differently from what you'd see on other synths. So ADSR for level is straightforward. You can have a slow attack and a long release. You've got global release control here, by the way. So release can take a while if you want it to. So the VCA envelope or level envelope is a regular ADSR envelope just like any other synth. The filter envelope, though, works unlike any other synth, but it actually makes a lot of sense. So the sustain level is whatever the filter cutoff point is set at. So you don't need a sustain level. You just set that using the filter cutoff slider. What you can do is lower the initial level, notice -5 here, for the attack stage. So you can bring the filter up into the cutoff frequency. And then you can also bring it down from the attack level, the high level above the cutoff, above the sustain level, so to speak, using the decay. So this is mod depth, sort of like for the decay. This is sort of like mod depth for the attack. And of course you can do both. What takes a while to wrap your head around is that the attack stage spans from the initial level to the attack level. And then release is the return to the initial level. Ultimately, the end result is an offset ADSR envelope. One last thing about the filter envelopes, the high-pass filter and the low-pass filter follow the same envelope in the same direction. If you like, you can reverse that direction using the menu of the direction for the high-pass filter so that it would move in the other way. Currently, if you use that setting, it applies to all the presets, so it'll change how everything sounds. Hopefully in the future they'll make it so that that high pass filter reverse mod will work on a preset basis and be saved on a preset basis. So we talked about the envelopes, we talked about pulse width modulation. Let's talk about our final modulator, the LFO or sub oscillator. The sub oscillator or LFO lives in the bottom row. Remember, that's the twilight zone of slider directions. So let's say modulate the filter cutoff, moving speed down will increase the speed. Moving mod depth down will increase the mod depth. And mod destinations are pretty much here. So it's either the filter cutoff, vibrato for the VCOs, or tremolo for the VCAs. Like I mentioned earlier, it goes slightly into audio rates. So you can get a texture out of modulating the VCA or VCF this way, even the VCO. So you can get gentle AM or FM. Mod depth isn't bipolar. You've got a few shapes. Ramp down, ramp up, square, random at the LFO speed. And then sample and hold is an interesting one. So this doesn't exist in the Mark I or the CS-80. What this does is roll the dice every time you press a key and assign a different value to the sub-oscillator, and then you can apply that value to either level, pitch, or the filter cutoff, which means every note gets an independent modulation depth value per key press, which can create nice effects, especially for, say, when you use a sequencer. Like I mentioned earlier, you also have aftertouch control for the LFO. And pitch bend is an initial slight bend into the note based on how hard you press the key. It's almost undetectable here. One important aspect of the LFO is that you can set it to work either in polyphonic mode, meaning that when you press a new note, the LFOs of the two notes won't necessarily be in sync, which is a pretty cool option. However, if you don't like that, you can go into the menu, it's in the time menu here, and choose LFO mode, change it to mono, and then the LFO for all 8 voices will always be in sync, regardless of when you press a key. And then you also have an option to re-trigger the LFO when you press a key. You can turn that on or off. Deckards also has a few additional onboard controls inherited from the CS-80. Keyboard control lets you add or remove brightness and level from the bottom half or top half of the keyboard. It's sort of its version of filter and keyboard tracking. It's a nice way to balance out the levels and brightness of extremely low or extremely high notes in your sound. Other global controls are portamento and gliss. You can either have it turned off, have portamento on, which is a continuous slide between notes, or glissando, which is a chromatic glide. You can hear it more across longer ranges. And then finally, you've got 2 sustain modes. Sustain mode 1 is a round robin motion between the different voices, between the 8 voices of Deckards. And then sustain mode 2 always resets things to the first voice. So there are a few interesting side effects to this. Sustain mode 1 is how most polyphonic synths work, which means notes with long releases don't cut each other off. You can force that though in sustain mode 2, so notes don't overlap. This isn't a mono mode though. You can still play chords. An interesting side effect to the way that this works is that if you go into sustain mode 1, you can pitch bend entire chords as long as they're held. However, if you press a chord with a long sustain and leave it, then hold another note, you could pitch bend just the pitch of the note you're holding, which is a pretty cool effect you can do on a non-MPE keyboard. Okay, moving on, Deckards Dream has a few other replicant superpowers that exceed the capabilities of the original. It has a Unison mode in the menu. Go into voice and activate Unison mode. And then you can choose the number of voices that participate in Unison. So 1 is obviously just 1. Now, you can also control the detune of these voices here. So that's an 8-voice supersaw, and if I go back into mix 2, then I can bring in a second layer of 8 oscillators for a total of 16 oscillators in unison across the 8 voices and 2 layers in each voice. Now, of course, in this mode, the keyboard is monophonic, so you can't play chords. However, there's another mode. Let's go back into polyphonic mode and go into cards per voice. So using this mode, let's go back to a single layer. I could assign cards to pairs. It's 2 cards per voice and 4 cards per voice. So you can play 2-note chords in this mode, not 3. They'll steal each other, or if we go down to 2 cards per voice, play 4-note chords. There are a few other options here. I won't go over all of them. You can extend the ranges of the LFO or the pulse width modulation. And yeah, you can reference obviously the manual for additional options that are available here. Just go through these very quickly, and you can pause the video and take a look if you're interested at the different controls. So that's pretty much it. The screen is tiny, but once you've got things set up the way you want, I don't think you need to reference it too much. Before we head out to the pros and cons, Deckards Dream has not one but two different third-party software control options. One works as a Max for Live plugin and another called Sebastian, which works both standalone and as a plugin you can use in your DAW. Deckards sends MIDI CCs when you move its sliders, so you can use it as a software controller. You can't send the whole machine state to either of the software options, at least not as of the current firmware. However, you can use MIDI CC messages that these plugins send to Deckards to control it and automate the hardware or transfer presets to the hardware individually. But what I think is the more interesting option is this morph function, which morphs between all the presets in a bank you can load into the software. So all synths should definitely have this feature if you ask me. These are obviously best explored with reverb. And yeah, if you find something you like, you can just save it as a preset into any slot you like. It also has a fun randomization option, so you can play the preset lottery. I think this is a really fun way to explore a synth. Yeah, and again, just save it as a preset if you find something you like. Let's move on to the pros and cons. As usual, I like to separate them to hardware pros and cons, things that probably won't change, and software or firmware ones that might. On the hardware side, something that has nothing to do with features is the price. A fully factory-built Deckards Dream costs $3,750 before taxes and import fees. While that's way cheaper than buying a CS-80, still it's not cheap. You can get a DIY kit for around $1,000, but you'll need to buy parts at more than double that price, and you'll still need to build it, which is no small feat. Now, what's cheap or expensive is obviously a matter of value and alternatives. There aren't any other analog CS-80 replicants out there, so this is quite special. That said, you won't have access to a lot of amenities you may be used to from other modern synths at this price. Aside from a few bonus mod destinations here in the menu, there's no mod matrix. What you see is pretty much what you get, which can be, of course, seen as a good thing, but don't expect any additional mod destinations for the envelopes or LFO, or additional mod sources beyond what you see on the panel. I already compared this to the CS-80. Aside from the ring mod, it actually has a lot of improvements, and hopefully the upcoming Rachel module will be a way to add that feature back in which case this can do a lot more than a CS-80 while still retaining its character and expressive nature. Aside from that, while the screen is small, I have to say I didn't find it much of a con because there's not much to do with it. It's mainly a set it and forget it kind of thing. Obviously a bigger screen and more buttons would have been nicer, but would it have been worth the additional cost? I don't think so. Finally, on the hardware side, the single mono output isn't balanced. I always prefer those to reduce noise, and the build, while the wood is nice and the enclosure metal and solid, could use some reinforcement around the middle and between these two screws. If you pick it up from here or from here, the panel might bend in. It does bounce back immediately for what it's worth, and as Steve Jobs, rest his soul, would say, if you're holding it here, you're holding it wrong, but still it would be nice if they added a little bit of reinforcement around the middle on the top and bottom. Moving on from the hardware to the firmware side, meaning things that might be updated, I did find that Deckards gets out of tune a bit after a while. There's a quick tuning option in the menu, so it's not a big deal, and being detuned is a bit of the charm of this synth, so I'm not sure if that's a pro or con too, but something you should be aware of, that you might need to press the tune button and wait a minute or two while this retunes itself. Beside that, on my firmware wish list, since ultimately Deckards is digitally controlled, it would be nice to see more modulation options, say, for example, adding the mix slider as a mod destination. It also would be nice to have a multi-timbral keyboard split option so you could play one layer on the right, another layer on the left. I don't know if that's technically possible. On the pros side, and this is obviously a matter of taste, in my opinion, this synth sounds special, and yes, it does sound both like a CS-80 and Vangelis, but it also has a special character. A deep, strong bass coupled with a characterful filter that with a little bit of noise, poly aftertouch, and yes, when paired with a reverb, just sounds great. Sort of like both powerful and gentle at the same time. I think that, plus the expression features, makes the hands-on connection with what you play even more direct. Now, increasingly, we're seeing more and more synths that support MPE and polyphonic aftertouch, but if making the connection between the information your fingers send and what the synth does is buried in a menu somewhere, which it usually is, you're just not as likely to use it. Here, like I mentioned earlier, 10% of the sliders are dedicated just to aftertouch or pressure control, which is quite simply an invitation for expressive engagement, and if you're using NPE, don't forget to use the menu that routes the Y-axis to any number of other destinations. Bottom line, a CS-80 is expensive both in cost and real estate if the price of Deckards is within your budget, especially assuming an add-on for ring mod will become available in the form of the Rachel module. Deckards sounds close enough to my ears and extends the CS-80's functionality with MPE, Unison, a polyphonic LFO, in ways that are both meaningful and yet stay true to the expressive nature of the original. So that's it for Deckards Dream Mark II. If you liked the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.